In the late 1920s, you started to have comic strips that were not comic. That is, were not intended to be funny, which is what most comic strips had been. They had either been satire or, like the Little Bears had been the beginning of the quote unquote funny animal genre. But you're starting to see more and more of these strips that are serious, and they're kind of like the movie serials that were starting to be shown around this time. Now that sound movies had developed, one of the first ones was Tailspin Tommy, which was the first of several aviator adventure comic strips. This is 1928, May 1928, that Tailspin Tommy starts, and it's just about a year or so after Charles Lindbergh had made his famous transatlantic flight and sort of romanticized aviators. And there would be a lot of imitators of Tailspin Tommy. There would be a bunch of airplane-centered comic strips, including the following year, 1929, one called Connie, that was about an aviatrix, a female pilot. In 1929, on the same day, these other two comic strips debuted, both of them based on pre-existing pulp era pulp magazine properties. Buck Rogers and Tarzan. Buck Rogers being science fiction, and we'll actually talk in a few minutes about the story behind Buck Rogers. And Tarzan, of course, being Edgar Rice Burroughs' Jungle Man. Buck Rogers lasted until 1967, and Tarzan until 2002, although you'll notice I have an asterisk there. That's because 2002 was the year they stopped making original Sunday comics of Tarzan, but they've continued in several newspapers having reprints of earlier ones right up until the present time. In 1934, a couple of other very important adventure strips were debuted, including Milt Caniff's Terry and the Pirates, which follows the adventure of Terry Lee, all-American boy, who is living in 1934 China, and he's sort of the young ward to an action news reporter, and they wind up running afoul of Chinese pirates, and adventure ensues. Also, Flash Gordon, a space opera science fiction strip that is similar in some ways to Buck Rogers. In fact, sometimes people get Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers kind of mixed up. Here's the main difference. Flash Gordon was a college athlete who happens to get transported in 1934 to another planet. He and his girlfriend and their friend Dr. Zarkov, and they're transported to the planet Mongo, and they meet all these strange, mysterious races there. Buck Rogers is a World War I veteran who gets exposed to radiation and goes into suspended animation and wakes up 500 years later in the future, in the 25th century. So there's your quick rundown on the difference between Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. Here's something else that I find myself having to correct sometimes. People get confused on, especially people my age or older who don't know much about comics. I very rarely find anyone younger than me making this mistake, because for the most part, people younger than me are completely unfamiliar with Flash Gordon, unless maybe they've seen the 1980s movie. Okay, you ready? This is not Flash Gordon. And this is not the Flash. This is Flash Gordon, who is not a DC superhero and is not a member of the Justice League. They are not the same character. All right, thank you. Now, where were we? Oh, yes, Flash Gordon and Terry and the Pirates. One thing that both of those strips had in common was the type of villain that they featured. Terry and the Pirates, of course, this picture here, by the way, is from the French version. Terry et les Pirates, so don't let that fool you. Anyway, Terry and the Pirates often fought against Chinese pirates, and one of the Chinese pirate leaders was this woman known as Dragon Lady. She was mysterious, seductive, and treacherous. And that trope became such a common stereotype for female Asian characters, particularly Chinese characters, in the ensuing years. Sexualized and presented as mysterious and inscrutable and untrustworthy, to the extent that that common trope came to be called by the name of this character, the Dragon Lady trope. Now, for a while, during World War II, when China became the allies of the U.S. against Japan, all of a sudden the Dragon Lady was a hero. But that didn't last in the public consciousness. So if you hear someone referring to a Dragon Lady stereotype, that's where it originated. Now, Flash Gordon and his two human companions, Dale and Dr. Zarkov, wound up being transported to the planet Mongo, where they met all kinds of different races of people. Like I said, there were bird men and lion men, but the evil dictator in charge was this guy on the right, Ming the Merciless. Now, this guy's not supposed to be from Earth. He's not human. He's Mongoan. But notice that both his appearance and even his name have a very Chinese cast to them, which demonstrates that so far as the reading public in the United States was concerned in the 1930s, even on other planets, you can't trust Asian people. This meme, that of the malevolent Chinese mastermind plotting to take over the world, is known as the Yellow Peril trope, and it had already been well established by the 1930s in British literature, starting with the novel The Yellow Danger in 1898 by British author M.P. Shiel, who much later, around 1913, wrote a similar novel called The Dragon that was re-released in 1929 as The Yellow Peril. And more famously, the works of British author Sax Rohmer, including The Mystery of Dr. Fu Manchu and The Yellow Claw, both evil Chinese masterminds that would show up much later in Marvel Comics. More on that later. In the mid-30s, a couple of other important adventure strips that brought us even closer to the advent of the superhero, both of them by Lee Falk, Mandrake the Magician and The Phantom. Mandrake the Magician was a magician. He happened to have a black sidekick named Lothar, who was from Africa. He was a strong man, and he was presented in a heroic fashion. He wasn't presented with all the usual stereotypes of Africans and African Americans in the 1930s. That is, he wasn't portrayed as being outrageously stupid and cowardly, which is how black people often were portrayed. So there were still some issues. There was the fact that he was very much a secondary character and wasn't maybe the brightest bulb in the chandelier, but had that good heart. So a small step maybe in the right direction. The Phantom was maybe a small step in the wrong direction. The Phantom, alias the Ghost Who Walks, is a legendary figure, one of a long hereditary line of people to hold the mantle of the Phantom, who are tasked with protecting Africa, which, if you'll notice, he's a white guy. He is one of a long line of white guys that were tasked with protecting Africa, often from itself. So definitely some stereotypes going on there. But nonetheless, an important figure for a couple of reasons. Number one being that he was the first masked adventurer to headline a comic strip. The Phantom continues to be popular. He's like Jerry Lewis. He's more popular in other countries, particularly in Scandinavian countries and other European countries. He remains very popular today. And I want to round this section out by just mentioning a few more of the popular and famous comic strips that got their start in the 1930s before comic books came along in the mid-30s. So Blondie, which is still running in 1934. Little Abner, kind of similar to Snuffy Smith. There's a lot of hillbilly stereotypes in that one. That one has been folded for a long time. Dick Tracy, very famous comic strip that is still going. The intrepid police detective. And 1934, Jungle Jim, which I bet you thought that was basically another term for monkey bars, but it was a character in a comic strip and in comic books in the 1940s. And in the 1950s, Jungle Jim was the subject of a series of kind of B movies, kind of cheap movies, starring Johnny Weissmuller as Jungle Jim. This was after Weissmuller was considered too old to continue playing Tarzan, which he had started playing around 1930 or so. Which kind of brings us full circle back to Edgar Rice Burroughs and Pulp Fiction. Tarzan and Zorro being a couple of heroes who debuted in pulp magazines in the 19-teens. Now we're going to look at some of the pulp heroes who debuted in the 1930s, starting with Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, who was this guy who had been trained his whole life for his mind and body to reach the maximum of human potential. And then he used these skills and powers to go forth into the world and right wrongs. He was, in essence, a sort of a superman. I know I said early 30s, but let's go back a couple of years to 1928 and one very special issue of the pulp magazine Amazing Stories, the August 1928 issue. It debuted 2 short novels, each of which would have many sequels, and each of which would be extraordinarily influential on science fiction in general. First we'll look at Armageddon 2419 by Philip Francis Nolan, which introduced the character of Anthony Rogers, the guy who was exposed to radiation and slept for 500 years. He wasn't being called Buck at that point yet. However, after this, when Nolan came up with the idea of transferring this and adapting it to a comic strip format, he added the nickname Buck to his character. So the first appearance of Buck Rogers, essentially. And in that same issue, there was a story by E.E. Smith, alias Doc Smith, called The Skylark of Space, which was considered to be the first space opera that sort of established a lot of the conventions for that subgenre. Star Wars is space opera. E. Smith would go on to create a series called the Lensman series that would get its start not too long after this. And the Lensmen as well were very influential. Here are some artistic renderings of Lensmen down through the ages. The Lensmen were a galactic patrol who had these special lenses that they wore on their wrist that gave them psychic powers. Gee, does that sound at all familiar? Perhaps the greatest of all the pulp fiction heroes to come on the scene in the 1930s was Conan of Cimmeria, created by Robert E. Howard of Cross Plains, Texas, first appearing in the pages of Weird Tales, which was one of those pulp fiction magazines, in 1932, and appearing in many stories over the following 4 years, until Howard's career and life, sadly, were cut short when he committed suicide in 1936. Well, here you have some of the covers from that time period. Conan made something of a splash, but was sort of forgotten for a while. Robert E. Howard's original stories were collected together in a hardcover collection in the 1950s, but it wasn't until the late 1960s that the character reached a truly wide audience. And that's when Lancer Ace paperbacks started releasing a series of Conan books, 12 in all over a 10-year period, that in chronological order, not the order they were written, but the order they were set, included all of Robert E. Howard's original stories, and fantasy authors L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter actually finished some unfinished manuscripts that Howard had started, and they wrote several of their own to sort of fill in the gaps. The artwork, most of the artwork on those 12 volumes was done by Frank Frazetta, whose fantasy paintings have really captured the imagination of generations of people, whether it be from his days in EC Comics in the 1940s to his book covers, particularly of Conan, or his album covers. Marvel Comics got the Conan license, and Conan the Barbarian issue number 1 came out in October 1970 and was enormously popular. Barry Windsor Smith was the penciler for the first few years there, later replaced by John Buscema, who was the artist for many, many years. A lot of people would consider John Buscema's Conan to be the definitive version, although some people would consider Frank Frazetta's paintings, shown here again, to be definitive. Other artists that have been closely associated with Conan since the 1970s have included Alfredo Alcala, Ernie Chan, and Timothy Truman. Howard created several other fantasy heroes in the pulp magazines, which he returned to in multiple stories for each of them, including Solomon Kane, who was sort of a monster-hunting Puritan, King Kull, supposedly an ancestor of Conan, former king of Atlantis before it sank, Cormac MacArt, who was an Irish adventurer in the 5th century, and Bran Mac Morn, who was a a Pictish leader in the British Isles who was leading the resistance against the Romans. All of these, by the way, also appeared in comic books from Marvel in the 1970s. There was a movie about Robert E. Howard released in 1996 called The Whole Wide World, starring Vincent D'Onofrio as the writer. It was about the romance between Howard and Novelyn Price, his longtime girlfriend, who was I think a high school English teacher. Price had written a memoir about their relationship after his tragic death that this movie was based on. And I highly recommend this movie. In addition to having great performances by D'Onofrio and Renee Zellweger, and in addition to presenting information about the life of Robert E. Howard, it also has another element to it. It is very difficult, nigh impossible, to capture on film what it feels like to be a writer. And I think this movie does that as well as any that I've seen. Go out and watch it. Now, as promised, a few words about radio adventure heroes, such as, for example, The Shadow, who debuted in 1931, The Lone Ranger in 1933, and The Green Hornet in 1936. Now, all those would later appear in other media, but it was on the radio that they were introduced. Now, the Shadow, Lamont Cranston, was this guy who had, in the Far East, of course, mysteriously, learned how to blend in with the shadow so as to become virtually invisible. And he wore a mask of sorts covering the lower part of his face, and he was able to alter his appearance even, or the perception that people had if he did let them see him. And he went out and caught bad guys.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows.
Blue Call presents The Shadow, a man of mystery who strikes terror in the very souls of sharpsters, lawbreakers, and criminals.
In 1933, Detroit radio station owner George Trendle charged his employees with coming up with a radio hero for their station, one that would be really popular so that they could sell lots of ads. Two of the hottest things going in radio drama were Cowboys and The Shadow, the masked hero. So Trendle wanted something that kind of to hedge all of his bets, and maximize the opportunity to hit pay dirt. He wanted something that was a combination of the two. So his head writer, Francis Stryker, came up with the Lone Ranger, John Reed, R-E-I-D, a young Texas Ranger who, along with his company of Rangers, was bushwhacked by the evil Butch Cavendish. John Reed was the only survivor, and he was left for dead, but he was found, rescued, and nursed back to health by a Potawatomi Indian named Tonto, who became his best friend and partner. Reed decided to let John Reed be dead to the world. So far as anyone knew, he was buried along with the rest of his company, and he donned a mask to go out and seek justice, not as a member of a company of Rangers, but as a lone Ranger. Now, a couple of years later, 3 years later, 1936, Francis Stryker created another character, the Green Hornet, which also debuted on that Detroit radio station. The Green Hornet was secretly Britt Reed, that's spelled R-E-I-D, a a playboy, a rich playboy, who secretly fought crime on the streets at night as the masked Green Hornet. And instead of a Native American sidekick, he had an Asian American sidekick named Kato, played in the 1960s television series by Bruce Lee. Kato started off as Japanese. Then when World War II started and Japanese were kind of out of favor, he became Korean, and he just kind of switched back and forth over the years. Now, the Lone Ranger was John Reed. The Green Hornet is Britt Reed. They were both created by Francis Stryker. And it's not a coincidence that they have the same last name. In the storyline, the modern-day version of the hero, modern day is in 1936, Britt Reed, is the son of the Lone Ranger's little nephew, Dan, whose father, John Reed's older brother, had been one of the Rangers killed in the ambush. And Dan is sometimes a character, kind of a helper to the Lone Ranger. So the Lone Ranger is the Green Hornet's great uncle. A lot of folks don't know that. Anyway, here we are by 1936. We have masked heroes running around all over the place. In 2016, we finally got to see the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet in action together, thanks to Dynamite Comics. Although the Lone Ranger was in his twilight years in this story.
With the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty Hi-Yo Silver, the Lone Ranger. Hi-Yo Silver! Away!
Though maybe we shouldn't be talking about what happened in the comic books when we haven't gotten to the invention of comic books yet. So let's fix that.